Well, it's time to start doing 10 games per episode for the Commodore Amiga as well, and we start straight off with another one in the group of first games I ever saw and played on the Amiga. Oddly, Firepower by Micro Illusions seems to be a relatively rare game, at least as an original, but in my youth everybody seemed to have a copy of it. Firepower is basically a supersized version of Atari's old Combat. You play a one-on-one battle against either a friend or a computer opponent with one of 3 selectable tanks, all of which have different characteristics. A slow tank is more resilient, but with a fast tank you can evade enemy contact more easily. The game map is split into fairly similarly designed sides, and features plenty of structures you can destroy. Some buildings contain prisoners which you need to save and deliver to your own base, but the game can just as easily be solved by killing your opponent enough times. While it cannot be said that Firepower was particularly successful in a commercial sense, the concept did catch on and spawned games like Return Fire and Tank Arena, and I suppose even World of Tanks could be considered as something of a descendant. Firepower was such a steadily occurring 2-player game on the Amiga for me, and later to a lesser extent on DOS, that I was compelled to write a comparison of it early on in the blog's history. Link in the description if you feel like reading it. Today, it's not perhaps the most complimentary of Amiga's resources, but it represents well enough of the time it was made in, and for me, it is nostalgic as anything. Another game from my early Amiga sessions is a classic tactical shooter from Infogrames, which was released by many names, the original being Operation Jupiter. Most of us non-French folks know this game by the name of Hostages, or Hostage Rescue Mission, or if you played this game on the NES, you would have known it as Rescue the Embassy Mission. Why this many different titles, you might wonder? Alas, I have no clue. Hostages starts off with a brief intro animation in which a French equivalent of a SWAT team van drives in front of the embassy building and a number of men are sent off to do their job. This was already impressive enough to get you hooked in 1988, but the game itself was even more impressive. You start by sneaking 3 of your team members into designated spots around the building while avoiding getting into spotlights operated by terrorists. Completing a mission doesn't require 100% success, so even if one of your men gets killed in action, you can still move on to the next section, which is where you check all the windows of the embassy building with your snipers, with the intention of killing all the criminals. Next, you need to enter the building by other team members located on the roof of the embassy building by using a rope and swinging through a window. With that same man, you need to sneak around the embassy building and shoot all the terrorists while avoiding killing any of their hostages. Once the building is cleared, you need to lead the hostages to the exit. To me, Hostages has always been one of Infogrames' finest games, and continues to drag me to it every once in a while. I've also been meaning to write a comparison of it, but the amount of platforms it was released on is a bit too daunting, and some of the versions are next to impossible to get to play without original hardware. Perhaps someday. Who knows? Not one of my biggest personal favorites, but certainly a necessary game for any Amiga enthusiast to have played, or indeed have in their collection. We have Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe, developed by the Bitmap brothers and released in 1990 by Imageworks. I saw this game being played by pretty much all of my Amiga gaming friends in the early 90s, but I don't think I ever tried the game out myself more than once or twice on Amiga and PC back in the days. In the last 10 years though, Speedball 2 has been on my Amiga playlist on and off, simply because I wanted to give it the chance it deserves. I have to concur, Speedball 2 is an interesting game, like a futuristic version of American football with a few pinballish elements thrown into the mix, so it's the closest I've ever come to enjoy anything to do with American football. There are memorable enough elements all over the game: the insanely catchy techno theme song, the player enhancement shop, the upbeat gameplay that kind of resembles ice hockey more than American football. So I kind of feel like I've missed out on a great Amiga classic. The reason for this feel is, I suppose, that it's supposed to be played against a friend, which is something I've never tried so far. But the music and seeing the game in action is enough to take me back to the early 90s. The next game could have been also included in the Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC nostalgia trip lists, but Amiga was the only platform in which I ever managed to complete the NewZealand Story. So my fondest memories are of the Amiga version. Originally a 1988 arcade game, the NewZealand Story became a huge hit all over the world, largely thanks to its cute kiwi bird protagonist. And similarly to Bubble Bobble, it was ported to so many platforms that I couldn't possibly handle a comparison of the game, no matter how much I enjoy it. Being a Taito game, the NewZealand Story shares many characteristics with Bubble Bobble and its sequel, Rainbow Islands, such as the different weapon power-ups and the extend bonus letter collecting thing. The new things here are that the game is an omnidirectionally scrolling action platformer, there are hidden passages within the levels, the possibility to dive through underwater segments, and Kiwi's ability to take control of enemies' flying vessels. The NewZealand Story made such an impression on me on the Amiga that I had to purchase a copy of it for my Commodore 64, which admittedly was a bit disappointing, yet still playable enough. The odd occasion that I decide to have a nostalgia trip with the NewZealand Story, it's either the arcade version on MAME or the Amiga version on my actual Amiga. But part of the game's nostalgia has a lot to do with the friend I completed the game with, so trying to complete the game again by myself feels a bit too daunting of a task to even attempt it properly. One of the most celebrated adventure games of all time is a swashbuckling simulator called Pirates. And most of the game's fans seem to prefer the Commodore 64 version of it, probably for good reasons. Pirates is arguably Microprose's and, more specifically, the game's designer, Sid Meier's most beloved creations outside of the Civilization franchise, but that's because there hasn't been too many games released since, which would take the theme seriously enough to make it worth your time for more than a couple of hours. In Pirates, you enter the Caribbean Sea sometime in the golden age of piracy as a member of one of four nationalities: the Spanish, the English, the Dutch, and the French. At the beginning of the game, you can also select a special skill you prefer to use henceforth, whether it's fencing, romancing, or some other skill. The game is basically divided into two parts: roaming the seas and visiting towns, although you do need to do some battling either by guns or swords every now and then, as well as search for treasures on land. The main plot of the game is to find your lost family members by collecting clues from various kind of dubious characters all over the Caribbean, while building yourself notoriety of any kind you deem appropriate for your style. The game will last as long as you wish, although there is only so far you can actually go in it. I was first introduced to Pirates on the Amiga, and that's where I still prefer to play it, even though some say that the C64 version has some elements in it that the Amiga version is missing. My preference might have something to do with the way the Amiga version sounds and looks, and it is a bit faster to play too. Also, having only been able to play the C64 version as a cassette version back in the day might have ruined the experience for me a bit. But that doesn't mean the original C64 version isn't a great game, just that I happen to prefer the Amiga version, and that's what I usually return to. If you want to read a fairly comprehensive comparison of all the versions of Pirates, click on the link in the video description. Psygnosis was one of the most prolific game publishers at the turn of the 90s, and their focus on the Amiga resulted in such classics as Obliterator, Shadow of the Beast, and Lemmings. But my personal favorite from all their games has always been Lemmings 2: The Tribes from 1993. The original Lemmings is undeniably one of the brightest sparks of genius that made Amiga the hit computer that it was in Europe. Trying to control a league of small green creatures that seem to have no brains for themselves through increasingly difficult platform-style levels where platforming is impossible by using certain installable abilities might have been enough to make Lemmings a well-regarded puzzle game, but the possibility to do a kamikaze on them all within a few seconds when you found yourself in an impossible situation was probably the trick that made Lemmings the hit game it was. For me, though, the original Lemmings was a bit boring because 1. It's a bit slow, and 2. You've seen all of its party tricks within maybe 10 levels or so. Lemmings 2 features 12 different tribes, which are all needed to complete 10 levels to bring together all 12 pieces of a magical talisman, which helps them escape from the great darkness. The different tribes replace the more traditional difficulty levels, but the levels within the tribes themselves have a more organic difficulty progression. Compared to the original Lemmings' 8 skills for the entire game, the sequel has 51 skills, although a maximum of 8 are still given for the player per level. The skills are divided into 6 groups: wind skills, ground removal skills, building skills, shooting skills, movement skills, and miscellaneous skills. Mastering all the skills takes an inordinate amount of time though, and I have to admit to having still not managed to beat the game's all 12 tribes. The main reason for this is probably because the version of Lemmings 2 that was circulating in my area had a couple of disk errors that prevented the completion of 2 tribes. But perhaps someday I will manage to finish it, and if there's one Lemmings game that I ever intend to finish, it's The Tribes. Along with Another World, which was featured in the 4th Amiga episode of my Nostalgia Trip games, a similarly built platforming adventure called Flashback, also by Dolphin Software, is considered one of Amiga's most important games, and certainly one of the most important games to be developed in France. Flashback plays very similarly to Another World, but has a more zoomed out view of your surroundings, and is more strictly a flip-screen platformer. In fact, if it weren't for the adventure/puzzle elements of the game, Flashback would be considered more akin to Prince of Persia than Another World, which is often mistakenly considered to be Flashback's predecessor. To be brutally honest, Flashback is a bit difficult to get into thanks to its complex control system, which is to be handled almost entirely with your joystick. Conrad, the protagonist, is able to walk, run, crouch, jump various heights and distances, shoot, grab onto platforms and pull himself up and descend down carefully, interact with people and surrounding objects, all with the joystick. But you need to know exactly how the levels are designed to make all the jumps and drops successfully and safely. What's the most difficult thing about the game, though, is shooting, because you first need to draw your gun by pressing the spacebar and push the fire button to aim before firing, and you also need to be in a certain stance to be able to fire. It's all a bit too tricky for a joystick, to be honest, but it's manageable. And then you still need to use the keyboard to access your inventory and utilize items from within. I have to admit, Flashback isn't a game I revisit particularly often these days, but I was a bit obsessed about it during the late 90s. I watched my friends play this game a lot on the Amiga, and I completed it myself on the PC first, and later on the Amiga as well, and I even own Amiga and Super Nintendo versions of it, as well as a remake on Steam. The amount of hours I put into this game more than 20 years ago have now been conveniently forgotten though, and I'm having trouble remembering anything about the game apart from the first couple of screens. But it is such a pleasure to restart the game and rediscover everything in the game, that it takes considerable effort to stop playing it once you get properly started. So I rank it in the same category of dangerous nostalgia trip games as a similarly addicting and time-consuming Zelda: A Link to the Past. First-person dungeon crawlers were more of a PC gaming thing for me, but one game was above all other versions of it and Amiga-specific thing for me, and that was Horrorsoft's Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, published by Accolade in 1990. I didn't even learn of Elvira's existence until I read about this game in a magazine, and eventually played it on one of my friend's Amigas. The magazine review did mention it was based on a horror movie of a similar title, but what it didn't say was how Cassandra Peterson's character Elvira had been a hostess of a horror and sci-fi movie television program for 5 years between 1981 and 1986. But these kinds of things were inherently American, so we didn't get this sort of television entertainment here in Finland. Anyway, Elvira's first-person adventure slasher game was, from first impressions, an odd mixture of tile-based dungeon crawling, point-and-click adventuring, gloomy horror, and perhaps even mild erotica. Soon after getting properly started, it became apparent that the main ingredient in the game was horror, sudden deaths with gore-filled imagery. Being a young horror fan, this game became something of an obsession to me at some point, even though I never really got anywhere in the game. Just finding out as many kinds of death sequences as possible became a short-lived hobby, before the game was laid to rest until some 15 years later, when I started doing the comparison blog and wrote about the game in October 2017. Again, link provided in the video description if you care to read. Elvira is a hard game to play, thanks to its less than ideally cooperative fighting system, and some of its puzzles which are stupendously difficult to complete. But the horror elements are very impressively made here, particularly for its time, and to me, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, as well as its sequel, The Jaws of Cerberus, represent the finest horror adventuring available on any machine from that era. Highly recommended. The fourth game in today's episode to have a comparison featured at the Finnish retro game comparison blog is a fairly popular mini-golf game called Zany Golf, which was originally written for the Apple II GS. Despite the already notable amount of mini-golf games available for 8-bit machines, Zany Golf was the first such game that I ever got to play, and remains my favorite on all platforms it was released for, although my first experiences were on the Amiga. In Zany Golf, the designer Will Harvey took the concept of minigolf into a much more fantastical realm than ever seen before, with environments such as a hole blocked by a bouncing hamburger, magnetic fields, a pinball table, and even a breakout-like table if you can unlock it. Although Zany Golf only features 9 holes and the bonus breakout hole, learning to deal with all the strange hazards in each level takes enough of practice and experimentation to give the game plenty of longevity. Perhaps another part of its strange appeal has to do with its not exactly precise mouse controls, which results in a bit of randomness. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the often hilarious soundtrack as one of Zany Golf's biggest charms. For me, Zany Golf represents a clear time of transition from 8-bit to 16-bit gaming, since it never got an 8-bit conversion. It also represents Electronic Arts starting their last classic years, which would continue until 1992 or so, before they would turn into the graceless behemoth, spewing out endless run-of-the-mill franchise games. If you've never played Zany Golf, do yourselves a favor and have a go at it. For our final game for today, I've chosen a game most of you would probably dismiss as another Commando clone. Warzone, released in 1991 by Core. My nostalgia for this game is very specific. I first read about it in a foreign gaming magazine, the name of which escapes me at the moment, and the very much Commando-styled advert of the game was also included in the magazine. Being a Commando fan, this obviously got my attention. The first time I got to play Warzone was in the city I live in now, on one of my father's friend's son's Amigas, probably in 1992 or 93. I can't remember if I actually liked it back then or not, but this game connects me instantly to that exact time and place, and the people within. But as it is, Warzone is a Commando clone, or more precisely a clone of Ikari Warriors, as you can play the game in a simultaneous two-player mode. The differences are that you get rockets instead of hand grenades, loot crates with weapon upgrades, as well as a few hit points instead of just instant loss of life upon getting hit. There are 8 reasonably long and difficult levels to get through, which require a bit more careful processing than Commando. Most of the reviews at the time of release were reasonably good, but there's really no escaping the fact that the game was outdated long before it was released. But if you take the game for what it is, you will notice that it actually is a rather nice vertical shooter. Nothing special, but it does its job well enough and is a nice game to waste some time with a friend.